Hello, hello, hello. Tonight we are discussing the Constitutional Convention and the three main compromises made during the summer of 1787. We have a lot to cover tonight, so we're going to jump right in and get started. Inquiry question: how did the founders solve the issues faced during the convention? So the setting of the convention and why did they meet? It was the summer of 1787. It was a hot, muggy summer. And 12 of the 13 colonies decide we're going to send delegates to a convention to hopefully fix the Articles of Confederation after seeing that it wasn't working very well, especially after Shays' Rebellion. They met in Philadelphia, which is the capital of the United States at this time. In total, there will be 55 delegates coming to try to fix, not get rid of at first, but fix the Constitutional, or the Articles of Confederation. Some of the people in attendance were James Madison, a guy who had read over 100 books just preparing for the convention. You had George Washington, who came out of retirement to come to the convention. He will later be elected president of the convention prior to being an elected president of the United States. Ben Franklin, he's the oldest of the guys there. He was a famous scientist, statesman, who gave wit and wisdom to the convention. And then you have James Madison, again, who was the father of the Constitution. He took detailed notes, and we can still read his notes today. Some key people missing: Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. They were overseas at the time, so they were not able to attend. And then Patrick Henry refused to come because he smelled a rat, quote. He was afraid it was going to end up turning into something that would be like a monarchy, similar to what we had just fought our freedom for. So there were three main issues. 1, how many representatives should each state have? 2, should slaves count towards population? 3, should slavery even continue? It was very quickly decided, we're just going to get rid of the Articles of Confederation, and we're going to write a new document. That document will become the Constitution of the United States. So let's start with issue number 1, representation. So there were two plans brought forth on how could we figure out representation within the states. One was called the Virginia Plan. In the Virginia Plan, the legislative branch would have had two houses. A two-house legislative branch is called bicameral. Each of these houses would be assigned representation based on population. So the larger the population, the more representation you have. The states that would love this Virginia Plan were the big states, the states with lots of population, because then they're going to have more power and can pass the laws that are going to benefit them. The small states hated this plan, and they came up with their own. Their plan's called the New Jersey Plan. In the New Jersey Plan, the legislative branch would have one house. Within this, each state would only have one vote in the legislative branch. Again, the small states love this because then they have equal power with the big states. Big states hate this because they're representing more people, yet they have just as much power as a state that's representing very few people. So, a lot of discussion, and then compromise had to happen. Otherwise, the divide was just going to stick and nothing was going to be accomplished, and the nation would divide. And the compromise we get is called the Great Compromise. In the Great Compromise, the legislature would have two houses. It will be a bicameral legislature. This is what we have today because of the Great Compromise. We have a Senate, and in the Senate, the representation is equal for every state. This comes out of the New Jersey Plan. Every state today has two representatives, no matter how big or small. Then they took some out of the Virginia Plan. The House of Representatives, the second house of the bicameral legislature, would be based on population. The more population you have, the more votes you will have in the House of Representatives. As we get into next week and we get into checks and balances, both the Senate and the House have to pass something in order for it to go on to the president to sign into law. So by dividing into a bicameral legislature, it kind of cuts down on the fears of those that are afraid of big government, that are going to just kind of control the people, because there's more chances for something that's bad in the view of the citizens being stopped before it actually goes into place. So issue number 2, should slaves count as population? So in this one, it's not so much about large and small states, it's about North and South. The North wants slaves not to count for representation, but to count for taxes. The reason is most of the slaves at this time are in the South. So if slaves count for representation, slave states, the southern states, are going to have more power than the northern states, and slavery is never going to end. However, the North wants the money from the South, so they're hoping that they can convince them to make them count as part of the taxes. The South, on the other hand, they want the slaves to count for representation, but not for taxes. It's the exact opposite of the North. In the Southern's interest, they have a lot of slaves. They want more power and more say in the legislature, so they want all their slaves to count for determining how many representatives they get. However, they don't want them to count for when it comes to paying taxes. So out of this, we get what's called the 3/5 compromise. The 3/5 compromise says that 3/5 of the slave population will count for both taxes and representation. So not every slave will count, only 3/5 of the slaves. This can be seen as counting the slaves as only 3/5 of a person, but if you look at it from the northern standpoint, if they would have counted the slaves as a whole person, slavery, it would have been much harder to end slavery in the South, because the South would have had so much more power and been able to expand slavery easier. So that's issue number 2. Issue number 3, the slave trade compromise. Should slave trade continue? Again, the division here isn't small and large state, it's North and South. Northern states agreed to do absolutely nothing about the slave trade until 1808. This is something that satisfies the South. The North is able to just say, okay, we're not going to touch it for the next 20 years. And then we can start talking about it and go through the legislative process, hopefully, if we want it to end. That satisfied the South. The Southern states agreed to allow then the national government to regulate trade. This was a big issue because nowhere in the Constitution does it talk about slavery. It doesn't say slavery is legal. It doesn't say it's illegal. It just kind of leaves it as is and kind of puts it off and says we will deal with the slave issue in the future. So as we see, coming out of the Constitutional Convention, there were 3 main issues that had to be solved. How do we determine representation? Should slaves count as population for representation? And should slavery continue? And as a result, we get the Great Compromise, where we combine the Virginia and New Jersey plans. We get a bicameral legislature where the Senate has equal representation in all states, and the House is based on population. We get the 3/5 compromise for the slave population. 3/5 of all slaves will count towards population for both taxes and representation. And then the slave trade compromise, kind of to push it off for 20 years. However, the national government now gets to regulate trade between states and states in other countries. So, to wrap up, do you think the founders could have done things differently and still reached an agreement on the Constitution? Think about this tonight. Come up with an answer to this with some supporting reasons, details, and we'll discuss it in our convention that we're having in class tomorrow. Have a good evening.